The boarding door was less than 4 minutes from closing when Claire Whitmore looked at the tablet in her hand for the third time. Seat dosa flashed red. Seat assignment conflict. Verify immediately. Schifroned. The passenger was already seated. A man in a navy windbreaker leaned toward the little girl beside him, helping her buckle the oversized seatbelt with the kind of patience that came from doing everything alone. The girl's sneakers barely touched the carpet. She smiled at him. "Dad, are we really flying in first class?" "You earned it," he said with a grin. "Straight A's deserve at least one adventure." Claire took a slow breath and walked forward. She had learned years ago that hesitation caused chaos. Once passengers believed a decision was negotiable, the entire boarding process could unravel. "Good afternoon," she said professionally. "May I see your boarding pass one more time?" The man handed it over without complaint. "Nolan Mercer. Seat dosa." Exactly what the paper pass said. Exactly what the email confirmation on his phone showed. Exactly what the baggage tag matched. But the aircraft system insisted someone else belonged in that seat. Claire checked the screen again. SAME warning. She had seen software glitches before, but never on a premium cabin this close to departure. For a brief second she considered letting him stay until the gate agent could investigate. Then she looked at the boarding clock. 3 minutes. Her stomach tightened. Every delay meant paperwork. Missed connections. Hundreds of frustrated passengers. And she had promised herself after witnessing an avoidable aviation accident years earlier that she would never ignore a procedural warning simply because someone looked trustworthy. "Before we go any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever found yourself judged before anyone knew the whole story?" "Nolan Mercer?" Claire asked. "Yes. I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to step into the aisle for a moment while we verify your seat assignment." Nolan glanced at his daughter, then back at Claire. He didn't argue. He simply stood. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Quietly. "We're checking a discrepancy." His daughter looked up immediately. "Dad." Ismail, calm enough to fool almost anyone. "Just a little mix-up, sweetheart." Claire expected resistance. Instead, Nolan reached into his backpack and calmly produced a folder. Inside were printed itineraries, purchase receipts, and confirmation emails arranged in clear plastic sleeves. Everything was organized. Almost excessively so. "You probably need these," he said. Claire accepted the folder, surprised. Most passengers raised their voices long before they offered documents. Nolan did neither. He watched her carefully, not with fear, not with anger, but with the focused patience of someone measuring whether another person was willing to verify facts before making a decision. That unsettled Claire more than an argument would have. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Another passenger discreetly lifted a phone. The quiet curiosity that spread through first class felt far louder than shouting. Claire compared every document against her tablet. Paper. Phone. Identification. Everything matched. Only one thing refused to cooperate. The aircraft's live seating system. "Being here," the boarding announcement echoed through the cabin. "Final passengers, please board immediately." Time was running out. Claire closed the folder, looked Nolan in the eye, and made the hardest decision she believed her job required. "Mr. Mercer," she said, keeping her voice even, "until this discrepancy is resolved, I'm going to have to ask you and your daughter to leave these seats." Nolan didn't move right away. He looked down at his daughter, Emma, whose fingers had wrapped tightly around the stuffed gray rabbit she insisted on bringing everywhere since her mother's funeral 3 years earlier. The rabbit had one floppy ear and a faded blue ribbon Nolan had sewn back on himself after it tore during a camping trip. "Dad." Emma whispered. "Did we sit in somebody else's seats?" He crouched beside her so they were eye level. "No, sweetheart. We sat where our tickets told us to sit." "Then why do we have to leave?" He hesitated for only a second. "Because sometimes grown-ups have to. Double-check things before they know what's really true." Emma nodded, accepting the answer far more easily than most adults ever would. Nolan stood again and picked up their carry-on suitcase. "Lead the way," he said quietly. Claire wasn't sure whether she felt relieved or guilty. Passengers usually reacted with frustration. Some demanded supervisors. Others filmed the crew. A few became aggressive. Nolan did none of those things. That almost made the situation harder. As they stepped into the aisle, conversations around the first-class cabin slowed to whispers. "I knew something looked off. Probably trying to sneak into first. People do it all the time." Glyde pretended not to hear the comments, but she noticed Nolan had. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Not from anger. From restraint. He stopped beside the bulkhead, leaving enough room for boarding passengers to continue walking past. "I'll wait here," he said. Glyde appreciated that. At least the aisle wasn't blocked. She tapped through 3 different screens on her company tablet. Reservation history. Cabin assignment. Last-minute aircraft swap. Everything pointed in different directions. The boarding pass in Nolan's hand clearly assigned him seat 2A. The aircraft's live cabin map insisted another passenger occupied that reservation. Neither system explained why. A gate agent answered her headset after 2 rings. "Gate B18. This is Claire on flight 284. You have a seating conflict in first." The agent sighed before Claire even finished. "We're slammed." "That's the passenger's name?" "Nolan Mercer." Keyboard clicks echoed through the headset. "Reservation confirms first." Glyde frowned. "My tablet doesn't." "Mine does." Glyde glanced back toward Nolan. He stood quietly beside Emma, who was now counting airplanes through the window instead of asking more questions. The gate agent continued. "Maybe it's another sync delay. Can you clear it?" "I can't while boarding is active." "How long?" "I don't know." Glyde looked toward the boarding clock. "Less than 2 minutes." The captain would soon expect confirmation that the cabin was secure. A line of passengers was beginning to build behind the first-class curtain. One businessman checked his expensive watch with exaggerated annoyance. Another passenger openly pointed his phone toward Nolan. Glyde stepped slightly between the camera and the little girl. "See," she told the man, "please don't record other passengers. It's a public place." "It may be, but she's a child." The man reluctantly lowered his phone. Nolan noticed. "Thank you," he said. Those 2 words landed harder than Claire expected. She wasn't helping him. She was simply preventing something from getting worse. "Still," he thanked her. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can I ask something?" "Always." "If they made a mistake?" She looked toward Claire before lowering her voice. "Are they going to get in trouble?" Nolan smiled gently. "That's not what matters." "What matters then?" "Finding the truth." Glyde heard every word. She wished she hadn't. Because they sounded less like something a frustrated passenger would say and more like advice someone had repeated many times before. Her headset crackled again. "Claire," the gate agent said, sounding confused now. "I just found something." "What?" "The reservation history shows a change 28 minutes before departure." "What kind of change?" "I honestly can't tell." The line suddenly filled with static. Then disconnected. Glyde stared at the blank screen. 28 minutes. Something had happened. But whatever it was had left 2 systems telling 2 completely different stories. Before she could reconnect the call, another flight attendant hurried toward her. "Glyde." "What is it?" "The captain's coming out." Glyde instinctively straightened her uniform. She wasn't worried about being questioned. She was worried she still didn't have an answer. Behind her, Nolan rested a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. It had every reason to argue. Instead, he quietly watched the people around him rushing to solve a problem no one yet understood. And for the first time since boarding began, Claire found herself asking a different question. Not whether Nolan belonged in first class, but whether everyone, including herself, had reached a conclusion before they had finished looking at the evidence. Captain Daniel Reeves stepped out of the cockpit with the calm, measured pace of someone who had spent 25 years making decisions under pressure. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for the lead flight attendant who still hadn't confirmed that the cabin was secure. "Claire," he called, keeping his voice low. "What's holding us?" Claire turned immediately. "We have a seating conflict in first class, Captain." Daniel glanced toward the front row, expecting to see two angry passengers arguing over the same seat. Instead, he saw a father standing quietly beside his daughter. The little girl was tracing circles on the handle of her stuffed rabbit while the man rested one hand lightly on the carry-on suitcase between them. No shouting. No demands. No scene. Daniel's eyes settled on the man's face. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Recognition. "Nolan?" The man looked up. There was a flicker of surprise before he smiled politely. "Captain Reeves." Daniel crossed the remaining distance without hesitation. "It's been a long time." "It has." Then, in front of everyone standing near the first-class cabin, Daniel nodded respectfully. "Good afternoon, sir." The word hung in the air. Claire blinked. The businessman who had been checking his watch lowered it. Even the passengers still boarding seemed to pause for half a second. Daniel wasn't the kind of captain who used formal titles casually. Especially not with passengers. Claire looked from Daniel to Nolan, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. "You know each other?" she asked carefully. Daniel turned toward her. "We met professionally." He said nothing more. No explanation. No introduction. No hint about how or why. Nolan didn't add anything either. He simply gave a small nod. Claire waited for one of them to fill the silence. Neither did. Daniel finally asked, "What's the issue?" Claire handed him the tablet. "The reservation documents all confirm Mr. Mercer's first-class seat. The live cabin system assigns the seat to someone else." Daniel studied the screen. Then the printed boarding pass. Then Nolan's driver's license. Everything matched. What did the gate say? They confirmed his reservation, but their system disconnected before they could explain why the records changed. Daniel looked thoughtful rather than irritated. "Has anyone verified the aircraft change logs?" Claire hesitated. "We haven't had time." Daniel nodded once. "Then we don't know enough yet." It wasn't a criticism. It was simply a fact. Bingham, another passenger, spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If the captain knows him, can't you just put him back in the seat?" Daniel turned toward the voice. "No." The answer was immediate. "If we skip verification because I recognize someone, then the process becomes meaningless." The cabin fell quiet again. Daniel looked back at Nolan. "I'm sorry you've been caught in this." "I know everyone here is trying to do their job," Nolan replied. Claire watched the exchange carefully. There was no resentment in Nolan's voice. No attempt to use the captain's respect as leverage. In fact, he seemed almost determined not to. Emma tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Dad." "Yeah. Is he your friend?" Nolan smiled. "I'd say we're two people who crossed paths a long time ago." Daniel smiled faintly but didn't elaborate. Claire noticed something she hadn't expected. Neither man seemed interested in explaining their history. Almost as if it wasn't the important part. The important part was still sitting on the tablet in her hands. One set. Two different records. One of them had to be wrong. A chime echoed through the aircraft. The gate agent called the cockpit. Daniel answered, listened for several seconds, then frowned. "They've found another discrepancy," he said quietly. Claire looked up. "What kind?" Daniel handed her the headset. "They're asking you to compare the boarding scan timestamps." Claire stared at him. That wasn't a request to identify an important passenger. It was a request to reconstruct a timeline. For the first time, she realized this situation wasn't getting closer to an answer. It was becoming a puzzle. Claire slipped on the headset and replayed the boarding log while the last few passengers waited near the aircraft door. Gate B18, the agent said. Read me the scan time for Nolan Mercer. Claire tapped through the tablet. 2:41 de la tarde. A pause. That's what I have too. Claire frowned. Then why does my cabin map still show another passenger in 2A? We're trying to figure that out. She glanced at Captain Reeves. So it's not just my device. No, the gate agent replied. Something changed after boarding started. The line went quiet again as keyboards clicked in the background. Claire looked toward Nolan. It wasn't watching her anymore. It was kneeling beside Emma, helping her zip up the small pink hoodie she had taken off earlier. The cabin felt cooler now that the aircraft's air conditioning was fully running. You warm enough? He asked. Emma nodded. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me. Nolan smiled gently. Nobody gets in trouble because a computer is confused. Claire heard him. She wished she hadn't. Because she suddenly realized she had been treating the warning on her screen as if it were a fact instead of a clue. Captain Reeves leaned closer. What do you know for certain? Claire answered automatically. Mr. Mercer boarded legally. What else? His documents all match. What else? She hesitated. The gate system agrees with his boarding pass. Daniel nodded. And what don't we know? Claire looked back at the flashing warning. We don't know why the aircraft database disagrees. Exactly. For the first time since boarding began, the red warning on her tablet no longer looked like proof that Nolan was wrong. It looked like evidence that something else had gone wrong first. The headset crackled again. I found something, the gate agent said. There was an aircraft swap 34 minutes before departure. Some premium cabin assignments were reprocessed automatically. Were all of them updated? We honestly don't know. Claire closed her eyes for a second. Unknown. That word bothered her more than an error message. Because unknown meant every decision after that point rested on assumptions. A flight attendant from the rear galley approached. Claire, the passenger assigned to 2A according to the cabin map is already seated in 3C. Claire looked up. What? He says he never asked to change seats. Captain Reeves exchanged a quick look with her. Nobody appeared to be lying. Nobody appeared to be cheating. The puzzle had just changed shape. Claire walked back toward Nolan. I'm not ready to tell you what happened, she said honestly. But I am ready to tell you this. She took a slow breath. I don't think this is about someone taking the wrong seat anymore. Nolan studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. Then let's find out what it is really about. For the first time that afternoon, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of the problem. They were standing on the same side, looking at it. The boarding door remained open. That alone told Claire how unusual the situation had become. Every instinct she had as a flight attendant screamed that they should close the cabin, finish the paperwork later, and get the airplane moving. Dilas rippled across an airline schedule like falling dominoes. But Captain Reeves hadn't given that order. Not yet. Claire walked back to the forward galley, where another flight attendant had already pulled up the passenger list on a second company device. Look at this, he said. It pointed to two nearly identical reservation histories. One showed Nolan Mercer assigned to seat 2A at the moment he purchased his ticket 3 weeks earlier. The other showed the same reservation changing automatically less than 35 minutes before departure, without recording who had approved the change. There should always be a user ID, Claire murmured. There isn't. Captain Reeves joined them. Show me. Claire enlarged the screen. The aircraft change happened first, she explained. When they switched us to this aircraft, the premium cabin had a different seating map. Daniel nodded. So the reservation system rebuilt the seating assignments. That's what it looks like. But it left two different versions of the truth. Claire swallowed. One version had followed Nolan's original reservation. The other had followed the automatic rebuild. Neither system had fully replaced the other. A software conflict had quietly become a human conflict. Daniel looked toward the front cabin. Who's sitting in 3C? Clyde checked the manifest. Martin Ellis. She approached the middle-aged passenger with an apologetic smile. Mr. Ellis, can I ask you one question? Sure. When you boarded, did anyone move you from another seat? Frowned. I thought I booked Comfort Plus. You thought? The gate agent handed me a new boarding pass before I got on. Said I'd been upgraded. Did you request it? No. Clyde looked at his boarding pass. Seat 3C. The cabin map had somehow continued to associate him with 2A even though he had never sat there. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't entitlement. Martin Ellis was just as confused as everyone else. Clyde felt something heavy settle in her chest. She replayed the last 20 minutes in her mind. She had looked at Nolan. Seen the warning. Assumed the warning described the man. Instead of asking whether the warning described the system. She walked back toward the front of the cabin. Nolan was helping Emma color on the back of an old airport brochure. She had drawn an airplane with oversized wings and smiling windows. Dad, Emma said proudly, this one's ours. Nolan smiled. I think it's the happiest airplane I've ever seen. Clyde stopped beside them. I owe you an update. Nolan folded the brochure and gave her his full attention. We believe the problem started before you boarded. He didn't interrupt. She appreciated that. The aircraft was changed shortly before departure. During the automatic seat reassignment, two databases stopped agreeing with each other. So my ticket never changed. As far as we can tell, no. And the other passenger? He wasn't trying to take your seat either. Nolan looked toward Martin Ellis, who was quietly reading a magazine several rows back. Then nobody here is the problem. Clyde slowly nodded. That's what it's beginning to look like. For the first time all afternoon, Nolan allowed himself to lean back against the cabin wall. Not because the situation was over. Because it finally made sense. You know, he said softly, people usually think mistakes start with bad intentions. Clyde waited. But most serious mistakes begin when decent people trust incomplete information. The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Captain Reeves looked at Nolan with quiet recognition. Not because of who he was. Because he understood exactly what Nolan meant. Clyde lowered her eyes to the tablet once more. The flashing warning was still there. Nothing on the screen had changed. Only her understanding of it had. A few minutes earlier, that red alert had represented certainty. Now it represented uncertainty. And that changed everything. She straightened her shoulders. If this happened once, she said to Captain Reeves, it could happen again. Daniel nodded. That's the real issue. Clyde looked around the cabin. This was no longer about restoring one passenger to one seat. Somewhere inside the airline system, a flaw had quietly turned reliable records into conflicting versions of reality. If they simply fixed Nolan's seat and closed the door, the same mistake could follow another family onto another flight tomorrow. For the first time since boarding began, Claire knew what her responsibility really was. It wasn't just getting this airplane into the air. It was making sure they understood why the truth had almost been left behind on the jet bridge. The cabin clock ticked past the scheduled departure time. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Every extra minute meant another report, another explanation, another chain of delays stretching far beyond this single flight. Clyde stood near the forward galley, staring at the incident report already opened on her tablet. The cursor blinked beneath a simple question. Reason for passenger removal from assigned seat. She could choose the easy answer. Seat assignment discrepancy. Technically true. Simple. Plain. It would protect the crew from difficult questions. It would also leave the report suggesting that Nolan Mercer had been the source of the problem. Her finger hovered over the screen. Captain Reeves quietly stepped beside her. Have you written anything yet? No. Why not? Because I don't know what the report should say anymore. Daniel nodded. That's better than thinking you already know. Clyde let out a slow breath. If I write that the passenger was removed because of a seat conflict, nobody will investigate why the conflict existed. And if you don't, I'll have to explain every decision I made. She wasn't afraid of paperwork. She was afraid of something much harder. Admitting that she had acted too quickly. Across the cabin, Nolan sat with Emma in two temporary jump seats the crew had offered while the investigation continued. Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder, still holding her stuffed rabbit. Nolan gently adjusted her hoodie so it covered her arms. I noticed Claire watching. You look like you're carrying something heavier than a tablet. Clyde gave a tired smile. It feels that way. She walked over. I owe you another apology. Nolan shook his head before she could continue. You don't owe me another apology. She looked surprised. You owe the truth a complete report. The words settled between them. Clyde folded her arms. Do you know what the easiest thing would be? You've probably thought about it already. I could put you back in your seat, note that the issue was resolved, and we'd all move on. Nolan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Emma. When my wife was alive, he said quietly, she used to teach middle school science. Clyde listened. She always told her students that fixing the answer without finding the mistake only guarantees someone else will fail the same test. I smiled faintly. I've never forgotten that. Clyde felt a knot tighten in her chest. She realized this wasn't about protecting Nolan's reputation anymore. It was about protecting strangers they would never meet. A mechanic. A grandmother traveling alone. A young soldier flying home. Any one of them could be standing exactly where Nolan had stood if the system failed again. The interphone rang. Clyde answered immediately. Operations. Clyde, we need an update, the dispatcher said. Can the aircraft depart? She looked through the open cockpit door at Captain Reeves. It waited silently. We've identified a probable synchronization failure between the reservation database and the aircraft seating system, Claire replied. There was a pause. So, are you closing the report? Clyde closed her eyes for a brief moment. Everything inside her wanted to say yes. Instead, she answered with complete honesty. No. Another silence. Why? Because I don't believe we've documented the real problem yet. After ending the call, Claire turned toward Captain Reeves. I'm going to rewrite the report from the beginning. Daniel studied her for a moment. Even if it puts your own decisions under review. Clyde nodded. If my decision was based on incomplete information, then that belongs in the report too. Across the cabin, Nolan heard every word. He didn't smile. He didn't congratulate her. He simply gave a small nod of respect. Not because she had fixed his situation. Because she had chosen accountability over comfort. For the first time that afternoon, Claire no longer felt like she was defending a procedure. She felt like she was defending the reason procedures existed in the first place. Claire deleted the first version of the report. Every line. Every assumption. Every sentence that treated Nolan Mercer as the cause instead of the person affected by the failure. The blank screen felt strangely honest. Captain Reeves looked over her shoulder but said nothing. He knew better than to rush someone who had finally decided to tell the complete story. Another call came through from airline operations. This is the operations supervisor, a new voice said. We're showing a growing delay. Can we close this incident and push back? Clyde chose her words carefully. We can push back after we identify which passenger legally occupies seat 2A. We already know who is sitting there. No, Claire replied evenly. We know who was sitting there. We don't yet know who should have been. Silence. The supervisor tried a different angle. If both passengers are willing to cooperate, document it as a customer service issue and let corporate review the software later. Clyde looked across the cabin. Nolan was quietly reading a storybook to Emma, who had finally woken up. He used different voices for each character, making her laugh despite everything that had happened. He wasn't lobbying anyone. He wasn't asking for special treatment. It was simply being a father. Clyde lowered her voice. With respect, this stopped being a customer service issue the moment we publicly removed a passenger based on information we can no longer verify. The line went quiet again. Captain Reeves finally spoke. Put me on. Clyde handed him the headset. This is Captain Daniel Reeves. We will depart as soon as the passenger records accurately reflect the aircraft. I'm responsible for this aircraft, and I won't certify an unresolved discrepancy. His tone never rose. It didn't need to. When he handed the headset back, the supervisor had no further objections. Daniel turned toward Claire. What does your report say now? She read the first sentence aloud. Passenger temporarily removed from assigned seat after conflicting electronic records created an unresolved identity of seat ownership during boarding. Daniel nodded once. No blame. Not until the facts deserve it. Good. Just then another flight attendant approached with a printed operations log. I found the backup synchronization report. Clyde immediately took it. I like the tablet. The printed log showed every automated system event in chronological order. She traced each line with her finger. Aircraft substitution. Cabin remapping. Automatic upgrade. Database refreshed. Then she stopped. One event was stamped exactly 43 seconds after the automatic cabin remap. Synchronization interrupted. Retry pending. There, she whispered. Daniel stepped beside her. What interrupted it? We don't know. But we know it never finished. Clyde compared the unfinished synchronization with Nolan's reservation history. Everything suddenly aligned. His original assignment had never been cancelled. The replacement assignment had never been completed. Two versions of the seating chart had existed at the same time. Neither was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. Clyde looked toward Martin Ellis in row 3. He hadn't taken anyone's seat. Nolan hadn't occupied someone else's. Both men had trusted boarding passes generated from different stages of the same failed update. She walked to the front of the cabin and stopped in front of Nolan. I think we finally understand what happened. A closed the storybook. But understanding isn't enough, is it? Clyde shook her head. No. What comes next matters more. She took a slow breath. The official record needs to show that this wasn't caused by a passenger. It was caused by an incomplete system event, and by decisions I made before verifying the whole picture. Nolan held her gaze for a moment. That takes courage. Clyde gave a faint smile. I don't know about courage. What is it then? She looked around the quiet cabin. I think it's the first time today I've stopped trying to defend my decision, and started trying to defend the truth. Captain Reeves heard the exchange as he returned toward the cockpit. The final pieces were finally coming together. Now they simply had to prove them. Claire carried the printed synchronization log, the incident report, and Nolan's boarding documents to the front galley. For the first time since the boarding conflict had started, every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Captain Reeves reviewed the documents one final time. The original reservation remained valid, he said. Clyde nodded. The automatic remapping created a second seating record, but the synchronization process stopped before it could replace the first one. Daniel looked at the printed log. So the cabin map treated Mr. Mercer as if his seat had changed. But his ticket never legally changed. And Mr. Aegis? He accepted an automatic upgrade generated by the incomplete update. A acted in good faith. Daniel folded the report and looked directly at Claire. What should happen now? Claire didn't answer immediately. She walked into the first-class cabin instead. Every conversation faded as passengers noticed her. Some had watched the entire incident unfold. Some had quietly assumed they already knew the story. Now they waited. Clyde stopped beside Nolan. Her voice was calm, but there was no script behind it. Mr. Mercer. She took a slow breath. After reviewing the reservation records, the aircraft synchronization log, and the gate system, we've confirmed that your original first-class assignment was correct. Nolan remained silent. The conflict was created by an incomplete system update after an aircraft substitution. Ju did nothing wrong. The cabin stayed perfectly still. Gleide continued. I also need to acknowledge something else. She looked around the passengers before returning her attention to Nolan. I asked you to leave your assigned seat before we had verified the complete record. She didn't soften the words. She didn't hide behind policy. I was wrong to treat an unresolved warning as a confirmed fact. The businessman who had whispered earlier slowly lowered his eyes. Another passenger quietly slipped his phone back into his bag. Gleide turned toward Martin Ellis. Mr. You also acted in good faith. The incorrect upgrade wasn't your mistake. Martin gave a relieved smile. I figured somebody's computer had a rough day. A few passengers chuckled softly, breaking the tension that had filled the cabin for nearly half an hour. Captain Reeves stepped forward. We'll restore the seating assignments according to the verified reservation records. Martin stood without complaint. No problem, Captain. As another flight attendant prepared an available premium seat for Martin, Daniel walked toward Nolan. Mr. Mercer. Nolan picked up Emma's backpack. You can call me Nolan. Daniel smiled. Not today. A extended his hand. It's an honor to welcome you back to your seat, sir. This time the word carried a different weight. Not because it solved the problem. The problem had already been solved. It simply explained the respect in Daniel's voice. One passenger near the aisle finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. Captain, how do you know him? Daniel glanced toward Nolan, silently asking permission. Nolan gave a small nod. Girsago, Daniel began, I served on a flight crew involved in an incident that fortunately ended without injuries. The investigation wasn't looking for someone to blame. It was looking for the truth. A looked at Nolan. Mr. Mercer was one of the independent investigators assigned to review what happened. Gleide listened carefully. He challenged every assumption we made, Daniel continued. Not because he wanted to embarrass anyone, but because he believed incomplete facts create dangerous decisions. Daniel smiled faintly. The recommendations from that investigation changed procedures across multiple operators. Some of the safety checks we use today exist because he insisted that good intentions are never enough without verified information. The cabin remained silent. No one clapped. It didn't feel like the moment called for applause. It called for reflection. Gleide suddenly understood why Daniel had called him sir. It had nothing to do with wealth. Nothing to do with status. Nothing to do with influence. It was respect earned through years of protecting people, most of whom would never know his name. Nolan looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. I was part of a team, he said quietly. I never did that work alone. Daniel nodded. I know. Emma tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad. Yeah. Does that mean you help people stay safe on airplanes? Nolan smiled. I try to help people ask better questions before they make important decisions. Emma thought about that for a second. Like today. A looked at Claire. Exactly like today. Gleide met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. The seat had been restored. The report had been corrected. But the most important thing reclaimed that afternoon wasn't a place in first class. It was the difference between making a decision quickly and making one that deserved to be trusted. 23 minutes after the scheduled departure, the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate. The delay would appear in an operations report somewhere, reduced to a few numbers on a screen. Passengers on later flights would probably never know why this airplane had left late. But everyone inside the first-class cabin would remember something far more important than the delay. They would remember the moment assumptions gave way to facts. Nolan settled back into seat 2A while Emma leaned against the window, watching the airport slowly drift past. She held her stuffed rabbit against the glass. We're really going now, she whispered. We are. She looked at him thoughtfully. Were you scared? Nolan smiled. A little. You didn't look scared. Sometimes being a parent means staying calm long. Enough for your child to believe everything will be okay. Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. I knew it would be. Across the aisle, Claire finished the revised incident report before the aircraft reached the runway. She read the final paragraph one last time. No passenger misconduct. No unauthorized seating. No refusal to comply. Instead, the report documented a failed system synchronization, the decisions that followed, and the lessons learned from the event. She pressed submit. There was no dramatic music. No standing ovation. No instant forgiveness. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing the official record now reflected the truth instead of the first impression. Captain Reeves stepped into the cabin one last time before returning to the flight deck. He paused beside Nolan. I appreciate your patience today. Nolan nodded. I appreciate that you insisted on verification instead of assumptions. Daniel smiled. I learned that from someone. Nolan chuckled softly. We all keep learning. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Claire approached once more. I don't expect today to be forgotten, she said. It shouldn't be, Nolan replied. She looked down briefly. But I hope it can be remembered for the right reason. I think it will. She hesitated. I spent years believing that following procedure was always the safest choice. And now? I think procedures protect people only when people are willing to question incomplete information. Nolan nodded. That's the difference between following rules and understanding why they exist. Claire smiled for the first time that afternoon without forcing it. Thank you. For what? For reminding me that those are two different things. The aircraft turned onto the runway. The engines grew louder. Emma looked out the window with wide eyes as the airplane accelerated into the afternoon sky. Within seconds, the city below became smaller. The arguments. The embarrassment. The confusion. They all stayed behind on the ground. Later, after the seatbelt sign was switched off, Martin Ellis walked forward from row 3. He stopped beside Nolan. I owe you an apology, he said. I heard some of what people were saying. Earlier. Nolan looked at him. You didn't start it. No. Martin sighed. But I didn't stop it either. Nolan offered a handshake. Then let's both leave today a little better than we boarded. Martin smiled and shook his hand. Deal. Emma watched the exchange. Dad. Yeah. Why did everyone think you were wrong before they even knew what happened? Nolan looked out the window for a moment before answering. Because people sometimes confuse confidence with certainty. Emma tilted her head. I don't want to do that. I don't want you to either. She nodded seriously, as if storing the lesson somewhere she would remember for years. Looking back on everything that happened, the most meaningful part of this story was never who sat in first class. It wasn't that a captain called one passenger seat. It wasn't even the mistake itself. The real story was about how quickly people can build opinions from incomplete information, and how much courage it takes to slow down, verify the facts, admit a mistake, and make it right. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity before their background, career, income, or appearance is known. A well-tailored suit does not make someone worthy of respect. Neither does worn clothing take that respect away. Whether someone is wealthy or struggling to pay next month's rent, whether they fly in first class or the last row of the cabin, their humanity carries the same value. Judging someone as less deserving because they appear poor, ordinary, or different is not wisdom, it is prejudice wearing the mask of certainty. Respect should never be reserved for people after we discover they are important. Real character is shown when we offer the same kindness before we know their story. On that flight, a father regained his seat. A flight attendant regained her confidence in truth over assumption. A captain quietly honored integrity instead of status. And the little girl learned that justice isn't about having the loudest voice in the room. It's about having the courage to wait for the truth before deciding who deserves to be heard.